Okay, so hello and welcome to today's lecture entitled The Evil is the House Itself, Credit, Citizenship and Shirley Jackson's Haunting House. My name's Amy Bride. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of Manchester, and this is my second Romancing the Gothic lecture, so thanks very much for having me back. Today we're focusing on Shirley Jackson and her seminal 1959 novel, The Haunting of Hill House in particular. And the general premise that I want to outline today is that we can read Jackson's manipulation and reinvention of the haunted house trope in Hill House through the lens of mid-century finance to envision the haunted house as a symptom and signifier of spectral mortgage debt. Now I'm going to start by introducing Jackson herself, then move on to the post-war context in which Jackson was writing. Then I'll go into some detail with The Haunting of Hill House, and I'll round off the lecture with a look at how Jackson's revision of the haunted house narrative resonates in later texts by other authors. And two things I want to mention before I start proper. There is a content warning for this lecture related to very, very brief mentions of the following issues. So there is a mention of miscarriage, suicide, and infanticide. These are momentary mentions. I don't go into a vast amount of detail, but I didn't want you to be kind of caught off guard. So please be aware that they are in there. And I will give you a heads up in the paragraph that they appear in, and then give you a wave so you can come back if you don't want to hear that section of the lecture. Secondly, a big part of the lecture involves analysis of idealized gender roles and identities in 1950s American society. These are, by nature of the time in which they were conceived, extremely binary. And so rather than repeat myself all the way through, I'm going to sort of say at the start that when I'm talking about gender roles, I am specifically referring to the gender roles that were envisioned and idealized in the mid-century United States. There are, of course, many other gender options available. So, to make a start, Shirley Hardy Jackson is one of America's greatest Gothic writers and most famous disgruntled American housewives, something that will become increasingly relevant as the lecture progresses. Jackson was born in 1916, married husband Stanley Edgar Hyman around 1940. There isn't an exact date for that wedding, so it's just a estimate. They had 4 children together, and she published 6 novels, 2 memoirs, and over 200 short stories between 1938 and her death in 1965. She is famously one of the first women to refer to her own children as monsters or demons in writing, and due to her literary success, occupied both the role of main caregiver and breadwinner in her household, something that did not sit well with husband Stanley, who had the audacity to cheat on Jackson repeatedly throughout their marriage, as well as rationing her access to her own wages, thereby keeping a controlling hold over her throughout their relationship. As noted by even her own children in various interviews given about her life and work, Jackson was religiously dedicated to her writing career and would spend hours writing each evening, even after a full day of housework and childcare. One notable anecdote given by Jackson herself involves filling out a hospital form when giving birth to one of her children, when the doctor suggested that Jackson's occupation be filled in as homemaker, to which Jackson replied that she was actually a writer, thank you very much, and the doctor said, oh, we'll just put down homemaker. The domestic space and the imprisonment of women within restrictive households features heavily in Jackson's work, as does the inability of self-aggrandizing yet clueless men to comprehend what's staring them straight in the face. And I don't think it's difficult to see where Jackson derived her inspiration from. She is one of a handful of authors whereby you can almost guarantee a semi-biographical reading of her work because she's writing what she knows. Whilst the work that Jackson produced was in many ways ahead of its time in terms of her revision of classic Gothic tropes and her centralising of powerful and often malignant female characters, Jackson herself and the issues with which she grappled, both personally and professionally, were very much a product of their time. Following the Second World War, America was caught up in a tangle of gender reconformity and suburbanisation. On the one hand, you've got all of those soldiers returning home to find the workplace full of women, which then, of course, threatens the social dominance of men as the traditional breadwinners, as well as adding extra competition to the job market. On the other hand, you've got a significant influx of personal wealth sitting in veterans' bank accounts in the form of unspent wages, which American banks and businesses were looking to tap into. Enter the suburban home as the answer to each of these apparent problems. By promoting suburban living as the ultimate all-American dream, the United States government hoped to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Firstly, to reacclimate women to the housewife role and therefore re-establish the pre-war status quo of gender relations and employment. And secondly, to encourage citizens to spend their newly disposable incomes on houses, mortgages, carpets, appliances, and so on, in order to get that money circulating into the wider economy. So in order to get people to part with their money and to encourage women to return to homemaking as a full-time occupation, the United States government campaigned to idealize and nationalize consumer credit. In 1950s America, consuming credit and using credit to buy and furnish a house in particular was subsequently promoted as a patriotic act. I mean, there were literally government-funded campaigns, so paid by taxpayer money, telling people that in order to live a happy and healthy life, they needed to buy a house, and that doing so on credit was the equivalent of doing your good for the, doing your part for the good of the country. Effectively, it made you a good American at a time when fears around communism and what it meant to be an American were at the forefront of the national consciousness. As Elizabeth Cohen recognises, the explosion of consumer credit and borrowing kept the post-war mass consumption economy afloat. The value of total consumer credit grew almost 11-fold between 1945 and 1960, and instalment credit, the major component of the total by the post-war era, jumped a stunning 19-fold. In Cohen's words, this consumer's republic, this notion that spending money was patriotic and that good people spent good money on good houses, stood for an elaborate, integrated ideal of economic abundance and democratic political freedom. So when you chose which washing powder to buy or which microwave to get, that was you exerting your democratic right and therefore demonstrating you were a good American. That's the idea here. And this idea became almost a national civil religion by the late 1940s into the 1970s. This, along with the growing idea that a prosperous post-war America was one in which each family owned their own home, filled with the most up-to-date appliances, furnishings, and decor available on the mass market, meant that successful American citizenship and the future success of America by extension became intertwined with the ability to buy and maintain a house. And these campaigns were really successful. So between 1940 and 1960, the average percentage of homeowners across the US leapt from 43.6% to 61.9%. And so the middle decade of the 20th century can subsequently be understood as one in which the dream of homeownership, the duty of American citizenship, American gender roles, and American finance capital are intrinsically tied together, encompassing both personal and financial support of the US government under the guise of social aspiration. I would therefore argue that Jackson's preoccupation with the house as a kind of necessary evil and the ring especially true with both the socio-political and the financial environment of the time, in which everybody had house buying on the brain. So let's move on to The Haunting of Hill House, and I am going to spoil the ending, so I do apologise for that, but it doesn't detract from the ability to enjoy the book, so I hope you do forgive me. The Haunting of Hill House absolutely taps into this environment. Jackson's text, lauded by many as one of the best American haunted house narratives of all time, follows a group of misfit pleasure seekers as they explore Hill House for signs of spiritual possession. The protagonist, Eleanor Vance, a socially damaged and unstable young woman, falls afoul of the power of the house, which appears to alternatively embody the ghosts of her dead mother and that of its original owner, sadistic paternal tyrant Hugh Crane. After a number of paranormal experiences that affect Eleanor more than the other inhabitants, Eleanor is asked to leave the house by the group's leader, Dr. Montague. In response, and again, apologies for spoiling this ending, Eleanor drives her car into a tree in the front of Hill House's yard, committing suicide at the same time that she appears to commit herself to Hill House for all eternity, and adding herself to the haunting collection of previous inhabitants that have died within its grounds. Unlike other classic American haunted house narratives, from Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland to Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher and Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables, Jackson's ghost story performs a reversal of the traditional direction of haunting, and in doing so, rewrites the conventions of the American haunted house narrative. Put simply, Hugh Crane, Dr. Montague, and Eleanor do not haunt Hill House. Instead, Hill House haunts them. As Christine Wilson states, Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher is creepy, and Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables is haunted, but Jackson's Hill House is alive. This is made apparent from the very first lines of the novel, in which Jackson presents Hill House as the subject of the narrative, a live organism that is not sane, and therefore implied to dream with a psychological power and determination usually reserved for human characters. And so Jackson says, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. This personification of Hill House as a living building continues as the novel introduces the setting through the perspective of Eleanor's arrival. In Jackson's words, the tree branches brushed against the windshield, and it grew steadily darker. Hill House likes to make an entrance, she thought. Again, the relationship between the house and the occupant is reversed here. It is Hill House that makes an entrance upon Eleanor, rather than Eleanor entering Hill House. Once she finally gets a glance at the front of the building, encountering it face to face, and thereby classifying it as an equal subject to herself, Eleanor decides that Hill House is vile, it is diseased, and that she should get away from here at once. Her understanding of the house's appearance and imagination of its construction similarly imbues the building not only with a personality, but with a mind and strength of its own. She notices a manic juxtaposition in the face of Hill House, which seemed alive, with a watchfulness from the blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice. And Eleanor goes on to envision that this house, which seems somehow to have formed itself, flying together into its own powerful pattern under the hands of its builders, fitting itself into its own construction of lines and angles, reared its great head back against the sky without concession to humanity. Already, Hill House is enlivened with the ability of self-construction, seemingly against the subjective will of its architects, meaning that, as a house, a physical composition of building materials, as opposed to even a fully realised home, it already wields power over those who encounter it. The power of Hill House's architecture remains a source of haunting discomfort once Eleanor is inside. She and the rest of Dr. Montague's party find that the whole construction of the house is off, from the angles of door frames, walls, and corners, which are all at odds with the ones you might expect to find in a normal building, to the concentrically circular layout of the house, which means that, quote, some of these rooms are entirely inside rooms with no windows, no access to the outdoors at all. Each of the rooms is thematically decorated in gaudy colour coordination that assaults the senses in an echo of Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, and areas of the house are either materially repulsive, such as the deliberate cold patch in the disused nursery, or else physically impenetrable, as with Eleanor's reaction to the library, where she states, "I can't go in there," and despite all intentions to the contrary, Eleanor is physically unable to make herself cross the threshold. Michael T. Wilson reads Hill House's disjointed physicality as evidence of the ineffable, which he defines as that experience which should not, or indeed cannot, be named or rendered from phenomenological experience into language, like viewing the face of a deity or their messengers, because to do so is more than mortals can bear. This sensually and emotionally overwhelming experience would arguably be classified as the sublime in the Gothic context, in which the individual experiences a disrupted sense of order and a discombobulation of reason, imagination, and feeling, according to Gothic theorist Fred Botting. Indeed, as Wilson notes, Jackson's use of the ineffable in The Haunting of Hill House falls within this tradition of characters overwhelmed by their glimpse of the ineffable or numinous encounters with the preternatural, with the house itself offering the unbearable vision. Unlike previous manifestations of the haunted house, Jackson's house that haunts is the locus of subliminality and discomfort in the novel. Hill House as a structure is unpleasant to look at, be in, or experience, and Dr. Montague's mission of documenting what exactly is wrong with Hill House fails spectacularly, as he is unable to record in words precisely what is going on or its causes. His investigative methods fail to produce reliable results, and when he is able to pinpoint a source of paranormality, it repeatedly evades measurement, as with the cold spot in the nursery, which, despite numerous attempts, Dr. Montague is unable to measure spatially, temporally, or indeed by temperature, even though they all agree that a noticeable cold spot does in fact exist. Despite these repeated strange happenings, none of the characters are brought face to face with any disembodied spirits at any point in the novel. And yet Eleanor, Dr. Montague, and the rest are all undoubtedly haunted. It is then the house itself as a physical entity which constitutes the malign spirit of the novel. This haunting house then constitutes what Mark Fisher defines as the eerie as opposed to the weird, primarily because, quote, the weird is constituted by a presence, the presence of that which does not belong, whereas the sensation of the eerie occurs either when there is something present where there should be nothing, or there is nothing present when there should be something. Hill House, in not presenting its occupants with a traditional ghost, is a haunted house that actively lacks its haunting component. As such, the walls of the house itself step in to fulfill this role, creating the haunting house, which is eerie in its apparently sourceless spectral power. How then to reconcile this in the age in which houses and home ownership specifically are promoted an increasingly realised norm of the post-war era? If the houses of the Consumers' Republic are not haunted by ghosts, what fuels their haunting of the homeowner? I propose the answer lies in a deeper analysis of the support system of the Consumers' Republic itself, credit. The astronomical spike in credit consumption that characterised the Consumers' Republic, paired with the corresponding increase in home purchase, indicates that the post-war American dream of suburban home possession was immaterially attained, and those living in houses bought on such extended credit were not in full possession of their homes. Rather, the credit on the house could take up a life of its own at any given moment, potentially leading to repossession. And that's what happens when you get a sudden influx of interest rates. Your mortgage payments or your credit payments skyrocket and suddenly you can't afford them and you're out on your ear. It's not, I mean, it's happened before. It's not difficult to get to that point at all. Whilst the Consumers' Republic was and is characterised as an era of explosive credit, the financial reality of credit is that it is just debt by another name. When you buy something on credit, you are taking out a debt that you will have to be paid back later. And it's in a study of this debt where I believe the roots of Jackson's haunting house are to be found. In particular, the critical understanding of debt by new economic critics or those working in the economic humanities as ghostly colours this particular post-war dreamscape as something innately Gothic. Building on Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, which reads capitalism as an intimately Gothic system, Richard Godden identifies a curious interanimation of the textual, the spectral, and the economic in literary works that communicate fears of debt. In Godden's words, spectrality may be thought aptly to figure the key instruments, securitization, the derivative, from which finance capital accrues. Each instrument converts an absence of payment, absence of underlier, into a presence, translating loss, debt unpaid, staple displaced, into excessive gain, something apparently incarnate from nothing. What Godden identifies here is the reality of debt as something dually absent and present. Indeed, the notion of debt is the concept that value or obligation can survive into a negative existence beyond the point of being nothing or equating to zero. As such, common understandings of debt closely reflect the convention of the ghost as a persistent presence of someone beyond their death, which would usually result in their being physically and materially absent. Indeed, Colin Davis argues that the central reason for ghostly appearances is itself centred around concepts of debt, asserting that the dead man returns because he has not been duly laid to rest. The duty of the living to bury the dead has not been performed according to established practice, and the rite of passage remains incomplete. Once our symbolic debt has been duly paid, the domains of the living and of the dead can be kept decently separate again. The blurring of moral and financial debt here is central to what Godden recognises as the curious interanimation between money, ghostliness, and literature. For Godden, the reinterpretation of the moral debts traditionally signified by the ghost as the financial debts owed by the living leads to the spectrality of the former being adopted by the latter through their shared embodiment of absent presence. In this vein, Jackson's novel can be seen to explore the unsettling relationship between the textual haunting house, the credit-fueled post-war economy, and rising levels of contemporary housing debt that, given Godden's reading of debt as spectral, can be read as a haunting force in and of its own right. This spectral debt haunting the 1950s American economy accumulated through the drive of American consumer citizens to become homeowners. Louis Hyman describes how the borrowing began as soon as she left the city to tour an as yet unbuilt development where prospective homeowners reviewed the many borrowing options in easy-to-read pamphlets. Options for mortgage lending and credit extension were widely available, from the GI Bill that offered credit to returning veterans to Federal Housing Association loans that offered government-insured credit on new home purchases, both of which were supported by the Federal National Mortgage Association, commonly known as Fannie Mae, a government-supported corporation that securitized mortgages with the aim of keeping the market steady. As Hyman notes, Fannie Mae bought and resold the mortgages for both programs, making all those FHA and VA loans possible. This translates as a government-backed debt program which, whilst on the surface was presented as key to achieving the American dream as revised for the post-war era, in reality, expose millions of American citizens to bankruptcy should their ability to keep up repayments fall through. The government's profiting from such a debt trap not only highlights a darker underside to the promoted idealism of home ownership in the post-war era, but by association creates a federally sanctioned class divide between tenement living and mortgage holding. To be an ideal citizen in this framework is to participate in the government's milking of capital from its credit-hungry consumer citizens, desperate to achieve this suburban dream. Falling into the debt trap and therefore losing your ability to support government profits because you can no longer afford the repayments equates to a loss of this citizenship and national personhood. Exclusion from the dream of home ownership is thus a precursor to social invisibility and spectral citizenship. These Americans are still present, but have been erased from the national vision of success due to their decline into negative capital status. And I should make a point of saying here that this kind of comes from a larger thesis chapter of mine. And in that chapter, I do explore the effect of these kind of things on African-American citizens as well, particularly things like redlining laws, which actively and legally segregated neighborhoods and prevented African-American peoples, regardless of their income, from getting mortgages on houses in white areas. And so the idea of excluding certain people from the vision of suburban excess is very much along racial lines as well as gendered. Moreover, this spectrality triggered by debt extended beyond the home and its occupier. Purchasing a house then meant furnishing a house, for which department stores began offering installment credit and revolving credit, to the point where these outlets, which sold televisions alongside clothes and furniture, and which had branched into the suburbs to follow their formerly urban clientele, had more money tied up in consumer charge accounts than in their inventory. And that's an astronomical kind of statistic. So that's like someone, if you're in the UK, someone like John Lewis, or I guess in the States, someone like, I don't know, all of the names of the American department stores are gone. Someone like Selfridges or, I guess Barney's or somewhere like that. They have more money coming in through their consumer credit than they do in all of the stock they've got held in their warehouse. Like, that's a huge statistic. The fact that these charge accounts were granted based purely on the neighborhood in which the customer lived, and that families with a mortgage borrowed twice as much as families without a mortgage, concretely links this credit exposure to home possession. What's more, the deductibility of interest paid on credit purchases from the income tax of homeowners meant that borrowing was never an unattractive option. In Hyman's words, Americans embraced debt, so much so that the percentage of households using credit rose after World War II from 38% in 1949 to 54% in 1958. And again, that's a huge statistic considering that we're almost completely excluding all African American, Asian American, Native American, Latino Americans from this kind of worldview, because they weren't given credit, because credit is granted based on where you live. They weren't allowed to live in the right areas, and so they weren't given the credit to buy the stuff that they needed to fulfill the American dream. So that's just the white people, which makes that a huge statistic again. The problem with this credit epidemic is that if the department store extends credit based on the ownership of a house, which is itself bought on credit, there is nothing substantial underwriting the mass spending of the consumer's republic. This means that the post-war house, as well as the items that filled it, were purchased using phantom capital, money that would hopefully be earned and paid in the future, but which did not materially exist in the present. This in turn spectralizes the house as a physical property, rather than constituting a positive capital asset. The house bought on credit in fact signifies a negative entity via the debt owed to the bank. The indebted house, spectral due to its absent presence constituted by its physical materiality and negative capital value, therefore avoids complete possession by any person dead or alive, but instead threatens to possess and absorb all of the occupant's wealth before becoming repossessed by the bank upon mortgage default. The possibility of repossession subsequently haunts the ability of consumers to obtain credit in the future. The haunting of Hill House literalizes this spectralization by allowing its occupants to be haunted by the threatening construction and atmosphere of the house itself. The eeriness of nothing present where there should be something, at the heart of Hill House's Gothic power, can thus be read as a reflection of the lack of capital asset that the 1950s house should represent, but can't because it was bought on credit and therefore signifies a debt. Hill House as a haunting rather than haunted house therefore symbolises the prospect of haunting housing debt faced by the 1950s homeowner, and presents a vision of future haunting in the present in contrast to the traditional model of haunting in which the present is interrupted by the past. This spectralization of the house as property creates an intriguing dynamic between Derrida's understanding of debt as both a financial obligation that comes back to haunt you and as something which produces capital returns via interest payments, and Jackson's revision of the haunted house motif in American Gothic fiction. Derrida speaks of that which is destined to return as inextricably linked to desire, with the crypt signifying the ultimate vault of desire. The crypt as a vessel for the dead, who in Gothic contexts frequently return to disrupt the present, is a neat stand-in for the classic haunted house, which performs the same role on a spiritual level, right? It stands as a space in which the dead are allowed to return back to us. However, Jody Castricano reads Derrida's crypt metaphor in capitalist terms, asserting that the economic function of the crypt, like a vault, is to keep, to save, to keep safe that which would return from it to act, often in our place. She thereby turns that vault of desire idea into something more akin to a bank vault or a deposit box. The indebted house, symbolized by Jackson's haunting house, which is devoid of any actual ghostly presence, fulfills the terms of this second definition of Derrida's crypt. The house bought on immaterial credit continues to absorb credit through mortgage payments, absorb capital through mortgage payments, allegedly keeping this value safe as a secure asset until the point that the credit fueling the house becomes too far extended and the accrued debt resurfaces to financially destroy the occupant. What Jackson does in allowing Hill House to haunt its residents and thus making it resistant to possession is substitute the traditional ghost as a metaphor for unfinished business with a spectral presence that represents personal debt, transferring the power of haunting from the supernatural spirit to the house itself as a spectral asset. Moreover, the indebted house, once full of commodity items purchased on credit, becomes a vault of consumer desire, housing all of the goods that the consumer citizen wants and or needs in order to fulfill that projected image of the ideal post-war American suburbanite. The absence of the expected real value in the haunting house is further example of Mark Fisher's definition of the eerie, in which he claims can give us access to the forces which govern mundane reality, but which are ordinarily obscured, just as it can give us access to space beyond mundane reality altogether. This is precisely what Jackson's conventional revision does. By making Hill House a house that haunts, the financial threat lying dormant beneath over 50% of the nation's housing purchases is revealed as the malevolent absence of a material body of value, presented in the guise of the absence of an ethereal body of haunting that is the traditional ghost. How then is this spectral debt embodied in Hill House? Excuse me. If the haunting house is to be read as symbolizing the state of the American way of life, as in Dale Bailey's reading, Hill House underlines the uncanny, unheimlich, or unhomely nature of credit-fueled mass consumption, as the symbol of affluent success is distorted to the point where it is unhomely, at the same time that it remains literally homely in the sense that it is still a physical house. The architecture of Hill House, and its concentric circles in particular, means that no investigative party is ever privy to the whole picture. Hill House always has something unexpected and threatening hidden away out of sight, much like the debt-laden housing market. At no point can any financial actor, whether consumer or credit lender, know or understand every piece of information relevant to the market, and so must always trade with some blindness. The picture available is never complete, and so is always at risk of being undermined by as yet unknown factors, such as the extent to which the consumer's profile is already leveraged by credit. Hill House as a structure is thus a physical manifestation of the housing market's shadowy nature. Just when the members of Dr. Montague's party think they know where they are in the house, a new aspect is revealed and the perspective changes. At no point is any character fully aware of every aspect of the house, and so is always vulnerable to something unseen. But more than this, Hill House demonstrates the destructive potential of a house that haunts through the power of debt. As Eleanor explains, exorcism cannot alter the countenance of a house. Hill House would stay as it was until it was destroyed. Just as there is no magical, spiritual, or ritualistic remedy that will expunge the haunting influence of Hill House, there is also no alternative route to home ownership that would wipe out the accumulating debt of a mortgage. The only way to escape housing debt whilst maintaining the suburban dream is either to pay off the mortgage, interest, and any credit installments due, something that members of the Consumers' Republic simply could not afford to do, or else allow the property to become repossessed by the bank and therefore allow it to take possession of the next mortgagee who wants to take it on. However, even this would not eliminate the threat of the indebted house, but merely transfer its haunting onto another victim. The only real solution beyond buying it outright is thus to destroy it completely, thereby erasing its power as both a physical and spectral asset, and thus eliminating its ability to affirm ideal American citizenship. The hauntingly indebted house is thus dually a requirement of and epistemologically threatening to the post-war consumer identity. As an actual house within Jackson's narrative, Hill House would have had its mortgage paid off years before the scenes of the novel. However, as an asset, it has triggered inheritance challenges and experienced decreasing valuations since its construction. The original owner, Hugh Crane, left it to his two daughters, who then fought over its rightful ownership. The older daughter laid claim to the house itself, in which she lived in companionship with a local village girl, while the younger sister allegedly stole items from its decor each time she visited. As Dr. Montague explains, after the death of the older sister, there was a lawsuit over the house. The companion insisted that the house was left to her, but the younger sister and her husband maintained most violently that the house belonged legally to them and claimed the companion had tricked the older sister into signing away property that she had always intended leaving to her sister. The companion won her case at last, and could, in my opinion, have won a case for slander besides, and the house became legally hers, although the younger sister never gave up trying to get it. So here's a short mention for a trigger warning. So if you want to mute, and I'll wave at you. So following the suicide of the companion, ownership of Hill House was transferred to her cousins, the Sanderson family, who have had the house on the market for sale or rent ever since, without ever actually living or profiting from it. So we can come back now. What Jackson outlines in Hill House's history is thus a haunted maternal line of inheritance that, rather than representing wealth, constitutes an asset of decreasing value passed down from generation to generation. This echoes the haunted nature of Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables, as well as Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, whereby, in each instance, the titular property is not in possession of its rightful owner and is subject to paranormal events as a result. However, unlike either Hawthorne's Holgrave Mall or Walpole's Prince Theodore, who each regained possession of their family properties and thus put an end to their respective hauntings, there are no Crane descendants left to reclaim Hill House. As such, the only way to eradicate Hill House's status as a haunted inheritance would be for new residents to purchase it outright, and thereby eliminate the Sanderson family's wrongful claim upon the property, a fate that is ironically impossible. Within the confines of the novel, the Sanderson family's continued possession of Hill House indicates that the market for haunting property is down. In relation to the real-life purchase of post-war homes using phantom credit, even new homeowners would not erase the haunted nature of Hill House, but merely transfer its haunting forces onto new victims. Moreover, this haunted line of inheritance transforms Hill House from a livable home into an unprofitable asset, literalizing its unheimlich nature at the same as a site of haunting by making it an unhomely home. Unable to rid themselves of the property, the Sanderson family attempt to rent Hill House out for profit. However, Dr. Montague assures the group that no one has ever rented Hill House for more than a few days on account of the numerous scandals and reports of haunting that quickly scare potential residents away, and that he himself has only taken out a short lease for the purposes of investigating these same reports. This means that Hill House has not made any money and certainly not produced any profit or accrued any additional value for decades. More than this, each new mysterious death or account of madness in the house, which then leads to a tale of it being haunted, reduces the rentability of the house itself, and thus the profit margin available from renting it out in the first place. The fact that Luke, one of Dr. Montague's invited guests and the next in line to inherit Hill House, allegedly steals valuable items from the house itself, reads as him extracting the last remaining vestiges of material value while they still exist. All in all, Hill House is a money pit, and one in which the Sanderson family, whose acquisition of it deviated the traditional line of inheritance, cannot escape. Ironically, it would make better financial sense for the Sandersons to burn Hill House to the ground and claim the insurance money, itself another spectral form of capital, given that, as Ian Balcom has identified, insurance extends the capital life of an item beyond the physical destruction of that item, and therefore constitutes a financialized equivalent of life after death. The owners of Hill House, and to a certain extent those who sporadically rent it out, are thus trapped by the inverse value of Hill House, which threatens to decrease into a negative entity over time. And that empowers the very walls of the building to haunt and destroy those who attempt to extract value from it by possessing and eventually absorbing them into its being. Though not itself indebted via an existing unpaid mortgage, Hill House thus acts as a symbol through which the future destruction of the 1950s indebted house is enacted in the present. The haunting capacity of Hill House as a building, the transition of the house from a promising family home into an empty, valueless vessel, and the physical and mental deterioration of those occupying Hill House all signify the various stages of financial destruction to which each house bought on credit was susceptible. By standing as a symbol rather than a symptom of this financial destruction, Hill House breaks the convention of the Gothic haunted house even further, as rather than presenting a component of an unsettled past interrupting the present, Jackson disrupts the present with a vision of a haunting future. Hill House's occupants, who are destroyed by the haunting house, thus represent the 1950s homeowner at risk of possession by their house as a spectral and destructive asset. And now is the time for that slide. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Okay, so we've looked at how Jackson's Hill House haunts and the ways in which this is expressive of and connected to, connective to the post-war American economy. Now I'd like to look at how this haunting affects Eleanor, Jackson's female protagonist, and the impact of the Consumers' Republic on women more generally. Whilst the haunting influence of Hill House is undeniably strong, some occupants are revealed to be more susceptible than others to its powers. More than any other member of Dr. Montague's group, Eleanor feels the effects of Hill House on her body and mind as soon as she arrives. After describing this arrival in terms of being swarmed, as Hill House came around her in a rush, Eleanor finds her disposition altered. She says, "If I hadn't seen Hill House, would I be so unfair to these people?" And the perspective of her own physicality is distorted when, gesturing towards her suitcase on the floor and watching the wavering reflection of the hand going down and down deep into the deep shadows of the polished floor. Here, Eleanor is granted a preview of her future possession as she sees herself inside the physical structure of the house, a further example of Hill House's representation of the haunting future as opposed to a haunting past. This absorption is reiterated once Eleanor is shown to her room, in which she feels like a small creature swallowed whole by a monster, and that she can't get away from the house. Before she has even spent a night in Hill House, Eleanor is firmly in its grasp, and losing grip on her autonomy as a result. Eleanor initially feels this loss as a physical dissociation from her own body. She begins to think of herself as a complete and separate thing, switches between first and third person, and compulsively catalogues her physical qualities as if reassuring herself that she still exists. So she says, "I have red shoes," she thought, "and that goes with being Eleanor. I am holding a brandy glass, which is mine because I am here, and I am using it, and I have a place in this room." Eleanor becomes similarly dissociated from her speech, giving an account of her life before Hill House that erupts from her mouth, apparently without her mind's approval. She says, "But that's not all," she thought, astonished at herself. "That doesn't even tell what it was like, even if I wanted to tell. Why am I talking?" Eleanor's ability to control what she says, or even when she speaks at all, rapidly deteriorates as the narrative progresses, punctuated by sporadic moments in which she seems to come to herself again, only to descend into incoherent ramblings once more. The question of who Eleanor is when she is not in her right self is indicated by her own wonderings about who is in control of her speech. On the very first night at Hill House, in a conversation regarding her previous fear of the house, Eleanor proclaims that, "I don't think we could leave now if we wanted to." Jackson's narrator, who reads as one of the alternative voices of Eleanor's consciousness, states that Eleanor had spoken before she realised clearly what she was going to say, or what it was going to sound like to the others. She saw that they were staring at her and laughed and added lamely, "Mrs. Dudley would never forgive us." She wondered if they really believed that that was what she had meant to say, and thought, perhaps it has us now, this house, perhaps it will not let us go. The narrator here, who again seems to emanate from Eleanor's own troubled mind, relegates Eleanor to a discussed object in the sentence rather than her being able to express herself in the first person, as she does in other parts of the novel. This, combined with the fact that Eleanor speaks before she is conscious of doing so, indicates that she is indeed a ventriloquist dummy being used by another, more active voice in the scene. The origin of this voice is pinpointed by Eleanor herself as Hill House. Her proposition that it has us now, this house, perhaps it will not let us go, crucially underlines the possessive power of Hill House at the same time that it raises questions of Eleanor's own mental state. Eventually, Eleanor becomes unable to fight Hill House's ever-encroaching possession of her, realizing that she is disappearing inch by inch into this house, and I'm going apart a little bit at a time. At this point, Eleanor internalizes the commotion of a suspected ghost banging on the door as originating in her own mind, wondering how can these others hear the voice when it is coming from inside my head? Here, the merging of Eleanor and Hill House is clear, with the rooms of the house and Eleanor's physical and mental being becoming interchangeable and equally haunted, and thus complying with what David Punter identifies as the defining characteristic of classic American Gothic fiction. Rather than constituting a rational self trapped in a haunted building, Jackson presents Eleanor's self as haunted and therefore completely irrational. She even readily accepts this loss of rational self to the house, assuring herself that it is over for me. It is too much, she thought. I will relinquish my possession of this self of mine, abdicate, give over willingly what I never wanted at all. Whatever it wants of me, it can have. And it should be noted here that the title of this slide, Eleanor is House, is actually what Jackson scrawled across her first draft of The Haunting of Hill House. So apparently after writing it for the first time, she kind of had a brainwave and went, oh my God, that's what I'm trying to write, and wrote out in big capital letters. So that's where that comes from. In literalizing the threat of debt and the resistance of possession signified by houses bought on credit in the 1950s, Hill House becomes the horrific element of the novel by consuming Eleanor's physical and mental well-being, to the point where she merges entirely with the building and ceases to exist in her own right. In doing so, Jackson's house stands as a warning to the 1950s credit consumer regarding the perilous future of their supposedly secure assets. If the homeowner defaults on the mortgage payment, the house transforms from a place of safety, shelter, and signified creditworthiness into a physically present but financially negative entity which threatens to destroy the individual's suburban lifestyle and haunt their credit profile for years to come. Yet whilst the threat of the indebted house would affect all inhabitants equally, the threat of Hill House is unevenly concentrated. Dr. Montague and his other guests, Theodora and Luke, all feel and acknowledge the uncanny influence of Hill House, but only Eleanor is affected to the point where she is physically destroyed by the haunting building. This subsequently begs the question, why Eleanor? What is it about her over Jackson's other characters that makes her such a prime target for this haunting? For this answer, I turn to Ernest Dichter, and I apologise in advance because he is a huge misogynist, and I'm going to read out this big quote to you, and I don't enjoy it, so please forgive me. Ernest Dichter was a market research psychologist whose work was read by producers and consumers alike. His work was popularly read by the American public throughout the 1950s and 60s. According to Dichter, only certain people qualified for the kind of ideal citizenship offered by the Consumers' Republic. As historian Daniel Horowitz notes, Dichter's analyses of patterns of consumption and the connection between spending money and self-realization pay abundant attention to women, who constituted a very large percentage of the purchasers whose sales Dichter was trying to promote. Whilst Dichter claimed that his research helped not only advertisers in their quest to sell merchandise, but also consumers and citizens in their search for self-understanding, in reality, Dichter outlined a variety of hierarchical groups of female consumers. The varying desirability of these groups then created an ideal view of American womanhood that was directly linked to a certain kind of consumption, at the same time that it ostracized many American women from this ideal view, thus hindering their prospects at self-understanding in any positive light. As part of this structured categorization of female consumers, Dichter persistently linked sexuality, desire, identity, and consumer culture, implying that the latter, consumer culture, would soothe and stem any abnormality, overzealousness, or perversion in the three former. The instability of Eleanor's physical and mental state in The Haunting of Hill House suggests that, according to Dichter's hypothesis, she has not been able to attain an ideal identity via consumption or reproduction, because he focuses a lot on maternity here, which may well explain why she is so vulnerable to possession by Hill House. The reasoning for this emerges through a further analysis of how Dichter categorizes this ideal in relation to their consumptive abilities. And so, as Horowitz describes, the first group, career women, felt trapped by domesticity and therefore hated housework. Consequently, they had unrealistic expectations for household products because they sustained no vital personal relationships to what they purchased. Although Dichter did not wish to pursue the neurotic basis of their rejection of the role of homemaker, He had made it clear that their unhealthy attitudes made them less than ideal consumers. The pure housewife, the second group, was also apt to be too critical of products, but for different reasons. Totally absorbed in housework, Dichter's report noted she had to prove that she is absolutely indispensable. As a consequence, she tended to be fearful of new products, nostalgically preferring familiar ways. Finally, there was the balanced woman, Dichter's favourite, whom he described as the most fulfilled emotionally. What made this type appealing to Dichter was her feeling of confidence, which comes from knowing that she is capable of both housework and career. Even though the balanced type derived pleasure from the activities outside of the home, she placed considerable emphasis on the home as a cosy shelter from an indifferent world. Dichter's three groups are thus defined by the level of focus each type of woman dedicates to domestic affairs, which then dictates how susceptible she is to the influence of advertisers. The pure housewife is too focused, meaning that she is unwilling to change her current routine and will therefore not buy new products. The career woman is not focused enough and so does not care what new products will be able to do for her, whilst the balanced woman has perfected the art of being independent and inquiring enough to seek out new ideas at the same time that she continues to fulfill the traditional housewife role, and so remains tethered to the domestic sphere, making her a prime target for advertisers. The idealised domesticity of Dichter's post-war woman is here inextricably linked from their participation in the wider credit market, with Eleanor existing outside of these categories of desirable consumer womanhood. Theodora, a guest of Dr. Montague's, is arguably a career woman. She describes the flat in which she lives with only minimal attachment to the objects within it, and clearly has enough personal income to buy expensive clothes and spend her leisure time socialising, which she discusses frequently. Housekeeper Mrs. Dudley's tunnel vision with regards to the upkeep of Hill House, including the correct storage of its dishes and exact timings for meals and cleaning sessions, satisfies the role of the pure housewife. This then leaves Dr. Montague's wife, Mrs. Montague, as a formidable matriarch with a solid understanding of domestic issues, in addition to an independent career in paranormal investigation, which far supersedes that of her husband, I might add, as the balanced woman. Yet Eleanor has no career, no house of her own, no husband with which to buy one, and is certainly far from being considered balanced in any respect. By not complying with any of Dichter's categories, Eleanor is understood as a woman who is not, in the eyes of the Consumers' Republic, woman enough. With no domestic anchorage through which to channel her consumption and therefore define her identity, Eleanor's womanhood is uncanny in the Freudian sense of being unhomely, in that she does not fit within the ideal of the domestic sphere. This then goes some way to explaining her desperate welcoming of the possession of Hill House, a move which attempts to internalise the domestic sphere as part of her identity, but instead sees Eleanor absorbed into the house, thus erasing her from existence entirely. The erasure of Eleanor as the uncanny woman takes form as her regression into childhood, with the various stages of womanhood and life passed by as Eleanor fails time and again to embody the type of domestication that Dichter so valued. The first signs of this regression appear when Eleanor, along with the rest of Dr. Montague's group, explore Hill House. Walking around the veranda, which she describes as like a very tight belt, Eleanor is startled by the house's tower, which, quote, rose up before her suddenly, almost without warning, grotesquely solid, jammed hard against the wooden side of the house. The phallic imagery here of an erect penis unleashed onto an unsuspecting young woman previously inspecting a belt line is particularly sinister, not just in the kind of the predatory content, but especially so given Eleanor's categorization as an uncanny, non-maternal woman. Here, the house appears to be forcing itself upon Eleanor in the hopes of coercing her into conforming to the ideal image of American womanhood by forcing her to interact with the phallus and therefore adopt a submissive sexual role as a stereotypical housewife. Here is your another content warning. So if you want to mute, I will give you a wave when it's okay to come back. This attempted assault continues when the group encounter the unexplained cold spot in the nursery. As the centre of maternal urges in the house, the nursery is tainted by an indefinable air of neglect found nowhere else in Hill House. The cold spot indicates a haunting lack of children and domestic conformity, particularly poignant given Crane's daughters' lack of offspring, which lead to the deviance of the inheriting line and subsequent transition of the house from a home into a debt-riddled asset. The nursery is then a vacuous womb at the centre of Hill House, a shrine to the lack of maternal identity, which the phallic tower tries to invade in a further attempt at mastery over the unhomely feminine space. And Jackson states, beyond the windows, the grey stone of the tower pressed close. Tellingly, whilst the men of the group are eager to prod and poke the nursery in their quest for answers, the women of the group only want to escape it. This not only plays into Dichter's misogynistic theories regarding female irrationality and women's apparent need to be shown the pleasures hidden in things that they were afraid of, which is a huge red flag, but also Jackson's concern with women's positions in patriarchal society, which Melanie Anderson outlines as an undercurrent in practically all of Jackson's work. In The Haunting of Hill House, the cause of Eleanor's alienation is her inability to conform to the balanced woman ideal. This then makes her vulnerable to the possessive advances of Hill House, which eventually takes her as another of its female victims. Eleanor's lack of agency against the powers of Hill House is a specific result of the male power wielded over her, including the dismissal of her fears by Dr. Montague, the house's attempt to force her into a submissive maternal role, and her eventual decline into madness, which Dr. Montague, and Dichter by implication, dismiss as a result of her lack of ideal womanhood and consumptive power, the boundaries of which were unfairly established by men in the first place. Following the episode in the nursery, Eleanor and Theodore are trapped in their bedrooms by an unseen force that hammers on their doors in an attempt to get inside. The intended invasion of the female bedroom, as well as the physical effect on Eleanor, which she describes as, quote, not pleasant. It starts in your stomach and goes in waves around and up and down again, like something alive, again implies that this is Hill House trying to assault its female occupants. This is confirmed by the conclusion of the event, in which Eleanor tells the force that it can't get in, which then triggers a, quote, a silence, as though the house listened with attention to her words, understanding, cynically agreeing, content to wait. A few days after this attempted intrusion, the walls of the women's bedroom were found bleeding, ruining Theodora's clothes and bedsheets, which Eleanor was last seen using. This simultaneously reads as the aftermath of a miscarriage, and that indicates a failed impregnation of the female space by the invading spectral force, the first blood of a lost virginity, and the menstrual blood of a young girl coming of age. Each reading sees Eleanor regress further back into childhood, a transformation punctuated by Theodora stating, "You look about 14." So this is my way for people who decided to mute to come back. Welcome back. Later, Eleanor's sleep is disturbed by a babbling, low and steady, a little liquid gloating sound that sounds like a child crying somewhere. That, given the crossover between Hill House's spectral phenomena and Eleanor's actions, could in fact be Eleanor herself, crying and gurgling while she sleeps in the fetal position, clinging to Theodora's hands because she is scared of the dark, something that Eleanor repeatedly says in the novel. Later still, Eleanor is described as thinking childishly and instructed to come along, baby. And so we can see here that at every stage, each time Eleanor acts out or is addressed, she becomes younger and younger. The final retrospective transitional stage, that between infancy and being fetal, occurs when Eleanor hears the voice of her mother calling her into the library. And the quote is, "It was warm, drowsily, luxuriously warm. She went barefoot and in silence down the great staircase and to the library door before she thought, but I can't go in there. I'm not allowed in there," and recalled in the doorway before the odour of decay, which nauseated her. "Mother," she said aloud and stepped quickly back. "Come along," a voice answered distinctly upstairs, and Eleanor turned, eager, and hurried to the staircase. "Mother," she said softly, and then again, "Mother." Despite the taboo of returning to the odorous, decaying, and forbidden chamber in which she feels closest to her dead mother, Eleanor feels protected and warm and no longer affected by the haunting vacuity of the nursery. By psychologically returning to the womb, Eleanor has all but completed her regression into non-existence. The final stage, of course, is completed by her later death. Given the post-war habit of figuring the relationship between national identity and consumption as a maternal one, in which kind of government campaigns frequently discuss capital and credit as the kind of mother's milk of the nation, it should be no surprise that Eleanor, as an uncanny woman, retreats back down the stages of human development, bypassing her own failed maternal identity in order to reconnect with that of her mother. Eleanor's regression into childhood as a result of her being haunted by Hill House thus reads as her inability to continue developing into a fully rounded adult due to the restrictive power of the domestic space. At the same time, Eleanor's lack of maternal identity prevents her from becoming an ideal woman, and thus makes her susceptible to possession by the house because she is unable to possess it as a consumer. By demonising the lack of maternal presence in Hill House at the same time that she highlights the domestic space as a void of female development, Jackson further distorts the notion of the ideal American citizenship, and specifically ideal American womanhood, as attainable through credit consumption. Not only is the house itself haunted by the overhanging debt that threatens to destroy over 50% of post-war home purchases, but Dichter's ideal of the female consumer is made extreme to the point where the uncanny or unhomely woman is destined to be destroyed by the very space that she has been told will restore her. What Jackson achieves as a result is a Gothic literalization of the mad housewife tale. In a merging of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, in which the home's decor is imagined to come alive and torments a confined and downtrodden woman into madness, and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where Bertha Mason is actually killed by the physical destruction of the home that was also her prison, Jackson's Hill House transforms the traditionally safe, albeit restrictive, domestic space into something that comes alive and actively attacks those within it. Literalizing the feeling of suffocation experienced by Jackson herself in the domestic role, Hill House feeds on the life force of its victims by simultaneously endangering their physical, psychological, and financial security. For Eleanor, the house really is out to get her, and her suicide on the grounds reads as both a rebellion against society's expectations of women in the domestic sphere and a resignation of her inability to physically escape this role. And that is our second seminar break, and my favourite GIF of the presentation. So enjoy that, and I will stop sharing to answer some questions. Oh, my Kindle's turned itself off, so there goes my script. Okay, so I'd now like to move on to some later examples of American haunting houses that I believe clearly follow Jackson's model. The first being Bret Easton Ellis's 2005 novel, Lunar Park. Now, Ellis is for many almost synonymous with his most alarming and most successful novel, American Psycho. I'd like to reassure anyone who's maybe thinking about dipping into Lunar Park that Lunar Park is a much calmer novel, both in terms of its violence, its sexual content, and its general grotesquerie. So I would really recommend it to readers who perhaps don't want to engage with something as extreme as American Psycho, but are still interested to find out what Ellis is all about. Lunar Park is also a much more accessible novel than American Psycho, which has a lot of really dense, commercially toned prose. There's like a whole chapter on Phil Collins, and he'll tell you every single ins and outs of each single button on his new stereo, and it's very clinical, which makes it, I mean, you can read it, but it's laborious and tiring and not always enjoyable. But yeah, certainly not to everyone's taste anyway. But Lunar Park is much kinder to the reader, so it's Ellis light if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Lunar Park, strangely enough, features Bret Easton Ellis, or at least a version of him, as the central protagonist. The novel presents itself as completely and utterly factual, despite showing the character Bret in a heterosexual marriage with 2 children, something that has never been the case for the real life Ellis. And it also has several really outrageous haunting elements that I at least would hope would not be plausible in a real life situation. I should say I'll be distinguishing between character and author here by name. So if I say Ellis, I mean the real life man, the author who wrote the book. And if I say Bret, I mean the fictionalized character that appears in the book. So in Lunar Park, Bret finds himself becoming increasingly distant from his teenage son, Robbie, with whom he struggles to have even a casual conversation, let alone any kind of meaningful relationship. During a Halloween party, Bret notices someone dressed as Patrick Bateman, the main character from American Psycho, wandering around the house. Upon investigating, Bret is unable to catch up with the party guest, but is instead accosted by the Turby doll, a kind of like mechanical toy eagle thing that belongs to his daughter, which has come to life and threatens to kill the whole family. Bret initially writes this episode off as either a drink or drug-fueled hallucination, but other strange events occur and continue to occur even beyond the Halloween party. Bret repeatedly gets visions of and messages from his dead father, or at very least, the bank vault in which his ashes are stored. Inanimate objects come to life, and the house itself steadily transforms so that it looks identical to Bret's childhood home in which he was repeatedly abused and neglected by his father. Bret is also stalked by the person dressed as Patrick Bateman throughout the novel, and he eventually decides that the way out of this mess is to write an American Psycho sequel in which Bateman is killed off. For some, unknown reason, this works. The stalking stops, and Bret is inspired to release his father's ashes from their bank vault, scattering them instead. This puts an end to the weird goings-on in Bret's house, and things return back to normal, except that in all of the commotion, no one's noticed that Bret's son Robbie has actually run away and is never to be found. So straight off, Lunar Park clearly takes its lead from the Haunting of Hill House by emulating Jackson's haunting rather than haunted house. And there's some intriguing gender dynamics at play here too. Bret is haunted by what is later revealed to be the ghost of his father, and simultaneously haunts his own children as an insubstantial and thus effectively absent parent, playing on the notion of the haunted present that we saw in The Haunting of Hill House. Bret's role is dually central and liminal in its location between two generations and position outside of the norms of reality. Graham Matthews argues that this ambivalence within Bret's character is reflected in the house itself, as it alternatively signifies as either shelter or entrapment. Matthews notes that the security of Bret's house in protecting against external threats, like the person dressed as Patrick Bateman, is undermined when the haunted house transforms into a house that haunts. As sconces flicker, televisions gain a life of their own, and a giant fanged hairball materializes from within and runs rampant around the house, it becomes clear that, much like the Overlook Hotel in Stephen King's The Shining, the Gothic threat is not so much contained within the walls as it is emerging from them. This is made explicit when the house transforms into Bret's childhood home, and it quotes, "Underneath the paint of the green striped wallpaper that had covered the walls was the house in Sherman Oaks." The metamorphosis of Bret's adult residence into the house where he was first mistreated by his father is not only indicative of the psychological origins of Bret's fear, but signals a crisis of masculinity associated with the prospect of being a bad father, with the coming alive of Bret's house serving as a warning against Bret becoming like his own abusive parent. Walpole's Gothic theory that the sins of the father are visited on their children is then literalized when Bret adopts a parental role within his childhood home, and thus shadows the position of his own father. And he says explicitly, the face of a father being replaced by the face of a son. The existence of one house beneath the other extends Matthews' reading of mirroring between the haunted house and the haunting Bret. That the childhood home, symbolic of the power and domain of the father, lies dormant beneath and eventually breaks through the surface of the adult Bret's home, creates a physical model of Freud's ego and id, or ID, not sure how that's said, that the id or subconscious part of the house is haunted by the threat of paternal rule, which is resented and fought against by Bret as the son, further categorizes this haunting as reminiscent of the Oedipal complex. So we have a lot of Freud in here. This materializes through Bret as he progressively inhabits a physical likeness to his father. He states, "My sisters marveled at how much I had begun resembling our father as I moved towards middle age." Just as Bret's father repeatedly misused alcohol, narcotics, and women, Bret harbours similar bad habits beneath the supposedly reformed facade that he presents to his wife and children. The jurisdiction of the father's haunting is thus not merely restricted to Bret's house, but is in fact living within Bret's physical body, just like Eleanor experienced Hill House as both a bodily and mentally troubling manifestation. Like the mask that is peeled away to reveal the diseased and threatening phantom body in Poe's Mask of the Red Death, Bret's house, face, and personal performance are stripped away to reveal the Gothic threat that has literally been inside the walls of the building all along, living inside Bret. Bret's existence as a haunted subject within Lunar Park is thus determined by a pattern of multi-generational haunting. While Bret is haunted by the ghost of his father, Robbie is also haunted by Bret performing the role of the ghost as a disconnected presence within the family home. The implication of Walpole's inherited sin experienced by Bret in his adoption of the parental role is thus a constant threat to Robbie, whom, it would follow, is destined to become Bret in the same way that Bret has become his own father. This is a clear echo, if not a straight-out masculinization, of the quandary faced by Eleanor in Jackson's novel. Eleanor is also haunted by her dead parent, the mother who, by definition, represents a thing that Eleanor both must and cannot become, according to the pressures of the Consumers' Republic, and is simultaneously made ghostly by her own lack of maternity, and is thus haunted by the idea of a child that will never exist, at the same time that she herself is clearly the haunting presence within Hill House. However, the paternal haunting of Lunar Park is not merely the utilisation of classic Gothic convention, but, as Richard Godden notes, laden with financial credentials that classify this haunting as a specifically late capitalist phenomenon. And I should state for anyone who's not aware, late capitalism is both a kind of financial and a temporal term. Generally, it's from kind of the 1970s up to the present day, and deals with the intense financialization of culture and capital, the computerization of money, which then distances ourselves from kind of physical materiality of valuable goods. And yeah, the kind of the fact that even high art and cultural items such as the Mona Lisa, you can buy on a notepad that costs a fiver from the Louvre. Like, it's even high culture has become commodified. That's what late capitalism is about. The various phantom forms that appear in the novel are, as identified by Bret, manifestations of his feelings towards his father. He says, "He's back. I had whispered those two words to myself that dark night spent, replaying what I'd seen out in the desolate field behind our house. I had involuntarily been thinking of my father. That his father's ashes were meant to be scattered but are instead kept in a safe deposit box in a Bank of America that sends repeated reminders of the vault's deposit duly signifies a debt owed by Bret to his father and the hoarding of that debt. In this sense, Bret becomes a late capitalist revision of Charles Dickens's Ebenezer Scrooge, spectrally reprimanded for keeping an unnecessarily full bank account by a ghost that symbolises what he will become in the future. Add to this the debt owed by Bret to Robbie as an unfulfilling father, and it becomes clear that, in order for Bret to put an end to his multivarious hauntings, he must pay off his debts to both father and son, thus reversing the pattern of patrimony. And patrimony is when the money of the father is inherited by the eldest son, who then leaves it to the eldest son, and so on and so forth. This tweaking of the traditional line of inheritance also stems from the haunting of Hill House, as with the Sandersons' inheritance of the property outside of the Crane family line, and demonstrates a perverse relationship between familial death, Gothic convention, and established patterns of financial gain. In addition to this moral or emotional debt, Bret is the heir to his father's estate that was left in arrears upon his death. As Joanne Watkiss notes, instead of simply gaining nothing, Bret inherits a negative value, an impossibility that cannot be articulated through traditional understandings of inheritance which insist on gain. Bret is then haunted by a father who on a parental level represents absence, and from a financial standing bestowed a negative value onto his son upon death. The sense here of moving beyond death, of having gone past the point of being nothing into being a negative entity, again marries the concepts of haunting and debt, so that the ghost of Bret's father becomes a specifically financial spectre. His sole purpose after death is to take from the living, to ensure that his debts and those owed him by others are repaid, so that he can rest as a balanced non-entity. Bret is not granted peace or freedom from his spectral debt until he fulfills the terms of his father's will, putting the ashes back into circulation rather than hoarding them in the bank. And he says, the ashes were collapsing into everything and following echoes. They sifted over the graves of his parents and finally entered the cold, lit world of the dead. It was all over. Just as Walpole's Manfred is forced to pay back the Otranto estate to its rightful heir before the castle can return back to normal, Bret is compelled to make things between himself and his father even before the ghost of Lunar Park can be put to rest. That real estate was, at the time Lunar Park was written, rapidly becoming a spectral asset, further provides a financial explanation for the haunting house motif central to the novel. And remember, this was published in 2005, so only 3 years before the 2008 financial crash. As Godden explains, between 2000 and 2005, US house prices rose an average of 51% and household wealth accordingly by 64%, which is to say that in America, during the first 5 years of the 21st century, one house became 1.5 houses. As more American homeowners treated their houses as speculative assets in order to draw fictitious capital from refinanced mortgages, the American home became increasingly spectral in its representation of value not materially present. So this is where we're talking about, you've got a highly credit leveraged mortgage in the first place on a house that's been hugely overvalued. You then use that, not the house, you use the mortgage, the promise to pay back that money as collateral to get another loan or another mortgage, to buy another house, to use as collateral, so on and so forth. It's just exponentially building, as we know, to the point of crisis. Except that this time, rather than Jackson's time, this time we're talking about the build up to the 2008 financial crash. So whereas the speculation in Jackson's era miraculously didn't end in this kind of big explosion. There were financial crises in the 70s, but not like on this scale. Here, the bubble does pop. The market does go boom. And we know that from retrospect. So we've moved on from people just buying everything on credit like they did in the 50s. We're now at the stage where people buy a house on credit and use the house as collateral for more credit and use that credit to buy another house and so on and so forth. And in doing so, with multiple hugely inflated mortgages that were taken out on misvalued homes under lending terms that are now considered illegal. The credit bit is being extended further and further beyond comprehension, and therefore so too does the haunting. For Bret, the emergence of an additional house beneath the surface of his adult home is then symbolic of both the debt owed to the ghostly father and the negative equity bestowed onto Bret through his inheritance of the father's indebted estate. That this phantom asset is literalized in Ellis's text furthermore serves as a warning against the prevalent speculation of late capitalist financial systems. The presence of the spectral house lurking within Bret's home is specifically due to the debt accumulated by the father's speculative failings. That this additional phantom house potentially haunts a multitude of families remortgaging homes between 2000 and 2005, and then right up to 2008, is demonstrative of a domestic haunting that cannot be contained within the domestic boundary. Instead, it infects millions of homes across America, meaning that in the 21st century, every US house is effectively a haunted house. Despite the myriad of similarities between Lunar Park and the haunting of Hill House, Ellis's text does allow the protagonist something that Jackson's is denied: the opportunity to escape and survive, and this ability is, I would argue, directly tied to the gender of each character. So in addition to the stuff going on in the house, Bret is also stalked by characters from his previous novels that appear to come to life directly from the page. Taking Nicholas Abraham's assertion that the phantom is nothing but an invention of the living as its literal definition. As aforementioned, excuse me, the most conspicuous of these is Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, who Bret describes as this tall, handsome guy in the blood-stained and dated Armani suit, lurking around the corners of the party, inspecting the guests as if they were prey. Now, it should be said that the crossover of characters from one novel to another is by no means unusual in Ellis's writing. You often have the main character of one novel appearing as a supplementary or even a background character of another. It's something that he does a lot. However, Bateman in this context does not appear as an additional character within a cohesive narrative community, but is understood by Bret as the entirely fictional protagonist of American Psycho, supernaturally animated into the real-life realm of Lunar Park. Bret's claim that he based Bateman on his father would initially suggest that this phantom is but another projection of the parental ghost in the haunting inherited home. Yet the explanation of Bateman's conception suggests that the source of haunting lies beyond the context of Bret's troubled paternal relationship. As Bret describes, American Psycho was written mostly at night when the spirit of this madman would visit, sometimes waking me from a deep Xanax-induced sleep. When I realised to my horror what this character wanted from me, I kept resisting, but the novel forced itself to be written. I would often black out for hours at a time, only to realise that another 10 pages had been scrawled out. The nocturnal visit, the demand from the visiting spirit for something taken against the victim's will, and the subsequent unconscious actions of the victim here mirror the experiences of Dracula's victims, thus reinforcing the idea that Bateman is a vampire, as I have peddled in previous work. So please do give me a Google and check that out. Essentially, I'm saying that Patrick Bateman is a vampire, but rather than go for kind of blood and guts, which he also does, his life source is commodity consumption. He's a commodity vampire. However, Bateman is not just a monstrous consumer of commodities here, but is actually a commodity in construction. Remember, this isn't Bateman the character as a kind of real person within the narrative. This is Bateman the literary invention. Bret's automation as a result of creating a character that would sell over 1 million books in the US in 53 prints by 2011 thus demonstrates Andrew Smith's theory on the disembodiment of the late capitalist labourer. Smith argues that the creation of commodities is a process in which objects are granted life that stems purely from the labour input of the worker. The loss of subjectivity experienced by the worker who, in performing the same labour repeatedly, becomes automated, subsequently objectifies the labourer at the same time that the commodity object is granted subjectivity. So we've got a kind of a life transference as the life of, or the life force of the labourer wanes, the life power of the commodity increases. This power exchange is clear between Bret and the spirit that creates and eventually embodies Patrick Bateman. For the character to exist and become commodified, Bret is forced into such extreme bouts of unconsciousness and delirium that he feels he can take no credit for the novel or its protagonist. Now, it's important to remember here that Eleanor, in The Haunting of Hill House, had no income, did not produce anything valuable, didn't possess the skills in which that she could do that, and so could not attain that balanced woman ideal of the Consumer's Republic, which then left her vulnerable to the possessive advances of Hill House. Just keep that in the back of your mind for this next little bit. Bret's description of the unwilling and subconscious creation of Patrick Bateman raises questions regarding the capital Bret receives as a result of both the success and controversy of American Psycho. And indeed, Lunar Park opens with a discussion of this money that the real Bret Easton Ellis actually pulled in. So before a single copy of the book is sold, Bret describes how the initial publishers forfeited a mid-six-figure advance in order to avoid association with the novel. And that really did happen. So effectively, Bret Easton Ellis got paid twice for the same piece of work, without having to provide any extra labour. Bret thus not only takes credit for a character that he claims was created by someone or something else, but also accepts a substantial capital payment that is then completely imbalanced against his labour input for the novel. Bret in Lunar Park is therefore both in receipt of a substantial debt by way of his father's negative inheritance and the recipient of a surplus value through his literary success. In short, he is haunted by the fact that he owes both money and labour. And in terms of the drive for 1950s housewives to become mothers, I would argue that Eleanor can also be seen as owing labour, and being pressured to produce something just by way of childbirth rather than work, which again is highly gendered. Seen through this lens, the figures of Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, Clayton from Less Than Zero, and the others that emerge from Ellis's writing to haunt Bret are thus further representations of debt as the source of haunting within Lunar Park. And here's the kicker in terms of the gender divide. Because he is a man, Bret is able to produce work that effectively quells his haunting in a way that Eleanor is not. Even if Eleanor worked and had a job that granted her financial independence, she would be expected to spend her money on household goods in order to attain that balanced woman ideal. And even then she would need a husband and children in order to be a fully fledged consumer. And of course, that husband would then transfer her ownership and claim of money and assets and whatever else to him as soon as they got married. So she's in a catch-22 at all times. And yet Bret is free to write away his own problems and get away with neglecting his kids to boot. The autonomy available to Bret is even more outrageous in light of the fact that his haunting is largely of his own creation. He decided not to fulfill the terms of his father's will, and he decided to accept money for a book he claims not to have written. That Patrick Bateman specifically demands rewriting in order to put an end to his haunting thus demonstrates the need for Bret to balance out his surplus capital with an equivalent labour input, something that Eleanor is never given the chance to do. And it's not even like it's her fault that she's unmarried and doesn't have children. Maybe she doesn't want children, but that's never an option given to her. Whereas Bret has children and isn't kind of either encouraged to look after them or shamed for the fact that he can't be bothered to do so. Bret goes on to write the American Psycho sequel, killing off Patrick Bateman, and doesn't receive any extra money for the story, but the extra work required goes some way to compensating for the double advance received upon publication of the original book, and therefore vanquishes Bateman as a phantom representation of Bret's labour debt. That Bret describes writing the extra story as advancing backwards indicates that the debt of the surplus advance has indeed been repaid, the debt paid back in order to return to a zero or equal balance. Here is your final content warning. Again, I will give you a wave when it's safe to come back if you choose to mute. So both Jackson's and Ellis's texts feature a house that haunts in which the furnishings move, voices emanate from the walls, and the past, present, and future all murkily blur into one. The key difference between the texts is that where Ellis's male protagonist is given a chance to work his way out of the problems he himself created, Jackson's female protagonist is doomed to suffer and die as a result of society's unfair demands on her mind and physical biology. And I'm very conscious at this point, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I've spent now nearly 2 hours talking about gender in very binary terms. And I think that's actually a central part of the issue here. In forcing these characters into strict performances of gendered roles that they do not necessarily conform or associate with, each experiences significant physical and emotional trauma that threatens their lives on numerous occasions. And so I would argue that it is not just the threat of death that is the problem here, although it is a very large problem of what's going on. And I think these texts are most useful when seen as warnings against the predatory nature of government-backed spectral debt. That said, I think the gendering of indebtedness, both as the female debt implied by non-motherhood and the male debt of work and productivity, adds an extra layer of danger that is also evident in other haunting house narratives. Take, for example, Toni Morrison's Beloved, in which the house also comes alive, much like Hill House. The source of haunting which powers the house in Morrison's novel is infanticide, which represents both the apparent failure of the protagonist Seth to conform to the traditional maternal role, even though she has very maternalistic reasons for why she did that act. And also in the antebellum context of the novel, the erasure of a capital asset for which the slave owner absolutely would have received government compensation for. Beloved thus demonstrates of debt and gender in the most brutal of terms, and speaks to a horrific history in which female slaves were valued higher than male slaves due to their ability to produce future slaves with their own price tags. In a more recent example, the first series of American Horror Story also deals with a haunting house similarly paints debt and gender with the same brush. Excuse me. The Harmon family managed to secure the murder house at an incredibly low price as a direct result of its haunting nature. Their real estate agent makes a point of telling them, as a matter of full disclosure, that the house has a grim history and that this is the reason the current owners are willing to part with it at such a rock-bottom figure. This, of course, recalls Hill House, whose equity continues to plummet with every new account of haunting within its walls. The reason that the Harmons are so keen to move into the murder house, aside from it being an absolute steal, is the fact that they are looking for a fresh start. Mrs. Harmon has recently suffered a pregnancy loss and repeatedly, tragically, questions her own value as a woman throughout the series. Her husband, Dr. Harmon, recently had an affair with one of his students and is therefore slated as a bad husband by his wife and a bad father by his teenage daughter, Violet. As such, the Harmon family are falling apart at the seams when they move into the murder house and are thus ultra susceptible to its malicious power. Strangely enough, it is only after Dr. Harmon murders his mistress, Mrs. Harmon gives birth to a new baby, and the pair reconcile as a newly strong nuclear family, that their survival in the house is secured. Although it should be said that this survival is somewhat tainted by the fact that this only happens after they've all been killed by the house itself, meaning that they survive as ghosts, who then further damage the salability of the murder house, thus enacting a debt spiral that will no doubt continue to haunt the house and its new occupants. And here's the wave to come back for people who muted. No doubt there are countless other examples of both debt-fueled haunting houses and the damaging gendering of debt in literature, TV, and film. And I would be especially interested in cases that see a non-binary gendered person face this kind of haunting, because I'm not aware of any of those. Maybe that's something we can go into in the discussion. But for now, that's the end of the lecture. It was just as well, because I think it's the end of my voice as well. So thank you very much for having me, and we will go to some more questions. Oh.
Thank you so much. That was great.